This past week, I had a chance to attend RecFest here in Nashville, which is a conference of recruiting and talent acquisition. It's basically an industry event where a bunch of recruiters, talent acquisition folks, and companies get together and talk about where things are heading in the market. I like to attend this every year to get an idea of how hiring is evolving, looking for emerging trends, and of course, sharing them directly with you so you can stay one step ahead of the competition. So if this kind of content interests you, make sure you hit the subscribe button. You may also want to hit that notification bell so you don't miss any future content. So the layout of this thing is basically there's a bunch of keynote speakers, a bunch of breakout rooms, and a bunch of vendors. So it's like talent acquisition companies, a lot of ATS or applicant tracking system companies are there, a lot of emerging technology, and then some major employers. My overall impressions this year versus last year is that the conference attendance actually seemed pretty light. A lot of the major employers that were there last year, like Indeed and like Greenhouse ATS Systems, a few big companies, were actually not in attendance this year. They didn't have a booth. They didn't have any sponsorship or anything. So I thought that was really interesting. And there seemed to be, my guess was probably 30, maybe even 40% less people than years previous. So I don't know if this is an indication of companies scaling back on hiring activities and really not trying to be a big presence in the market. In fact, most of the vendors were pretty small. A lot of them were startup type companies that were trying to solve similar things. And I think that was the first major trend that I saw. So less people, less overall participation. Companies are not sending their people to these things as much, which might be an indication of corporate spend. But a lot of the companies that were there, in particular, I'm talking about vendors and some of the presenters, the talk of the town was AI. And I'm sure that's of no surprise to just about anybody. It seems like every single product that's coming out now has an AI label slapped on it. And the problems that they're all trying to solve seem to me to be very repetitive and redundant. And I didn't see a whole lot of innovation. So I don't know if this is an indicator, a positive indicator or a neutral or a negative indicator. But basically what I saw is these vendors trying to replace recruiters with AI automation, which is kind of an interesting target audience because they're trying to market their services to talent acquisition. So more and more companies are starting to embrace AI as part of their talent acquisition strategy. So expect to see more outreach done by a robot, potentially first round interviews done by robots or these one-way interviews. So I think we're going to see an increase in that. And then the candidate sourcing is increasingly being done by AI. Used to not be this way, but now they're increasingly doing a lot of the sourcing and unfortunately, a lot of the ranking. Now there's a two-edged sword here with the ranking of a candidate in AI. Suppose you have 1,000 applications. A recruiter is not going to make it through all 1,000 applications. They may only get through 100 or 200 of them till they find a slate of candidates that they like, and then they're going to go and screen them and then submit the ones that they like best to the hiring teams. The rest of the candidates are basically in a holding pattern until those first group of candidates move through their process because the recruiter's got to go move on to other roles. What this AI sourcing, at least this is what these companies are telling us, what they're promising is that this new technology will actively scan all applicants. So you'll, in theory, get seen, but probably not by human eyes. And then they would pre-screen in some cases. You'd actually have an interview with them. So everybody would get an interview, which, again, I don't know if I like that or not. But nonetheless, everybody would get an interview. And then you would get submitted or at least put into a certain bucket. So the AI is not making a decision per se, but rather it's assigning a ranking, a weight, so to speak, for you based on what the job position is looking for, what the company has put out as a requirement. The recruiters can then look at the candidates who are flagged as a higher ranking, and then that's, in theory, where they would start their recruiting efforts. So that's a lot of what I heard in the AI space is mainly that component. Otherwise, the innovation just really wasn't there. I didn't see anything that was new and earth-shattering. In fact, it just seemed to be repackaging of the same AI tools I've been hearing about for the last 2 or 3 years. So I wonder if we're hitting kind of on the bell curve, the kind of a peak of the bell curve of AI slop and companies just throwing everything at it, throwing an AI wrapper on something, and then kind of having it become irrelevant. And I feel like a lot of the companies, so you have the vendors who are kind of pushing all this stuff, but a lot of the companies themselves, the actual companies who are hiring people, didn't really seem to be pushing the AI thing as much. And there was some discussion around how AI would work in the hiring process and whether or not companies minded if candidates used it. And I think that that was another big theme that came out of this is companies aren't necessarily, didn't seem like they were caring all that much if you used an AI generated resume, for example, so long as it was still authentic, that you weren't just putting in fake information, spitting out fake information back, and it wasn't the same as everybody else's. Because that's the one thing that I learned is that their ability to check and track what's going on in their applicant pool is actually pretty limited. They don't have great detection tools. And I actually asked that question very specifically. Can you tell if a resume is generated by AI or if the application is generated by AI? And the overall consensus for multiple companies that I spoke to and some applicant tracking companies is that they actually don't have great detection tools to date. There are some companies that are trying to figure that out, but when I asked them to kind of explain how their algorithm looked at resumes and determined certain things, suppose you apply for a job without using AI, but the system still thinks that you did and assigns you a certain status or a certain rating, maybe a little suspicious application profile setting. You could likely discriminate. I feel like this opens up a big can of worms. And so some of these companies hadn't really thought through that very well. And I'm curious if larger companies will become more sophisticated with that and what the potential legal implications are. So I wasn't really hearing a clear guidance from the companies on whether or not they use AI detection tools. In fact, I was hearing that there wasn't really much that they could do to even detect it. Kind of all boiled back to the eyeball test. It was very obvious to a lot of the hiring managers when somebody would use an AI tool to help them with their process. And it was probably more so around like AI interviewing, this the roboticness of somebody looking off screen. That was one of the things that came up. If you're looking off screen and reading off of prompts and these kind of like automated AI tools that help you with interviewing, that was something that was very specifically called out and pretty much unanimously. If they almost always knew when you were doing that, and if you would do that, you would be immediately disqualified. But it didn't seem like they had as much an issue with the AI generated resume so long as what was on the resume was still accurate. So that was good news as far as I was concerned. One of the other things that they were having an issue with is company fraud. That was kind of one of the big topics on some of the breakout sessions was people applying for jobs and they're not who they say they are. And a lot of times this is going to be around immigration, so around visas, etc. But a lot of people basically gaming the system. So there are some companies who are looking more and more into detection tools for fraud, which is not necessarily the same as AI, like using AI on your applications, but rather creating fake profiles altogether to defraud companies. That's apparently becoming a much bigger thing. So that was another major push by several corporations to try to combat this fraud issue that's coming up. I also found there's more and more companies moving toward more of an emphasis of the soft skills versus technical skills, in that the technical skills can be assessed through an assessment process. There's usually assessment there, but really where companies seem to be moving is putting more emphasis onto soft skills. The good news is about this is soft skill interviewing is something that you can learn and you can master. And so when I was listening to them talking about the problems and how they're approaching it through basically just behavior-based interviewing, they're starting to become much more focused on the soft skills versus the technical skills. So I thought that was a positive, but it operates under the assumption that you already have the technical skills in place. So you may expect to have a technical assessment on some level, but as you get into speaking with humans, you're likely going to be really focused on the soft side of things. Another big issue that was discussed is the aging workforce. And I think that this is something that companies are struggling to deal with the baby boomer generation is in mass moving out of the workplace. And in fact, even some Gen Xers are starting to get to retirement age. And there's a big bubble of people who are leaving the workforce with not as many people replacing them. Now, they also, this big picture is you're replacing a lot of these entry-level jobs with automation and AI and basically eliminating. So the Gen Z generation is finding it very difficult to get a footing in jobs. At the same time, companies are complaining that, or worrying about not having enough bench strength. So there are some companies out there thinking about this problem because we're going to have a very real labor shortage. Now, I think the labor market is going to look different than it did a few years ago. I think as automation comes in, and that's one of the things that they identified with the Gen Z group, is that they're more quick to use automation and tools. But what we're seeing is a mass exodus of a bigger generation moving out of the market and leaving a void. Now, it's going to be really fascinating to see how companies manage this if they're laying off everybody and they're making it so hard to get entry-level jobs because there's going to be no bench strength. So I think that's something to pay close attention to as we go forward. Will we see an increase in the number of entry-level positions to start building bench strength, even though these are the exact roles that companies are targeting for AI? And one of the last themes that I found is that companies are starting to look increasingly at other ways to source candidates. And the potential that LinkedIn is starting to mature, it's actually a matured company. Back in 2022, it reached its peak of users, and it seems to be heading in a little bit of a directionless future. So look for companies to increasingly be sourcing candidates outside of LinkedIn. So you should start asking yourself that question: where can I be found if not on LinkedIn? And we'll be talking more about that on this channel as well. So these are some of the major trends coming out of the talent acquisition industry as a whole. And I think if we know this, we can use it to our advantage to start positioning ourselves for tomorrow. Again, I didn't hear any major changes. In fact, I felt like last year there was a bigger push for AI than it is this year. And this year, it seems like, I hate to say this, but it seems like a lot of the bottom feeders are just jumping on the bandwagon with AI, slapping AI on the names of their products and throwing AI tools in that really don't add any bona fide value. And I think that that's probably, in general, what we're seeing with the AI market as a whole. I wonder if we've hit a point of inflection, and are these AI tools as revolutionary as once promised? As of right now, I'm just not seeing it. I wonder if we're in a bubble and things could change. But I will keep paying attention to the market. As always, appreciate you watching. We'll see you on the next one.